Introduction. My name is Julieth Diaz Benitez. I am an educational psychologist, an educator, and researcher as well. I currently serve as an instructional design faculty member at College of San Mateo in San Mateo, California. And I have two screens, so I will be looking both ways, but I promise I'm paying attention to you, and I will do my best also to be looking at the chat. But before we get started, I wanted to say I do not claim to have all the answers. What I do bring today is the perspective that I have gained from the process of conducting testimonial research and the insights from someone who has been thinking about this for quite a while. I am hoping that this can be a collegial exercise to exchange ideas, perspectives, insights. I don't think that agreement or like consensus is the goal today. I think we are here for diverse perspectives, and we will see where the conversation takes us. But with that, I have decided to title the session today Testimonio, Telling and Living from the Margins. And before we jump in, I wanted to just give you a window into what I'm understanding as the margins in this session today. I am understanding the margins as the place where the other has been pushed to, but also as a place for transformation. So I would like you to keep that in mind as we go through the slides and through the different stages of this session today. For our time together, I'm thinking that we will start talking about what are the roots of testimonio. You may or may not be familiar already with this term and this approach, so we will start there. Then we will move on to talk, what do we mean by testimonio as a research methodology? Because I do know, and thank you for the questions, I do know that many of the questions were directed towards that. Then we will talk about how we build a process of testimoniando, and then we'll open it up for conversation because that's what this is going to be. But I thought we would start today reading something that came from a work of testimonio. So as we read the following excerpt that you're going to see in just a few seconds, I am going to ask you to write down, or if you don't want to write down, just think about this. I want you to think about, what does it tell you about a testimonial approach to research? And if you know nothing about testimonial yet, I would even say this is a more beneficial exercise. What are your first impressions, your thoughts and reactions to what you are about to listen? This excerpt is coming from the dissertation work of Dr. Marisol Quevedo, who used a testimonial methodology approach for her research. And this particular fragment is coming from the discussion chapter of her dissertation, which was written as a letter to her participants. And I think it's only ideal that Dr. Quevedo reads this part of her work. I believe she's in the audience already.
I'm here.
There she is. So we're just gonna get started here whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Dear participants, you are key makers, not gatekeepers. As you shared throughout your lives, your journey through education and to your careers has been riddled with struggle, challenges, and doubt. You discussed feelings of imposter syndrome, feelings of inadequacy, feeling like you and your work was never enough. You bravely shared stories of the spirit murdering you endured as students and employees in academia. You have come across many gatekeepers in your life. Those who monitored and decided whether you should have access to certain spaces and at what cost. Those who were intent on making you prove yourselves, who questioned your worthiness and qualifications. And I was in awe of how steadfast you were in your beliefs, values, and commitment to serving students, that you did so with the care and love at times that others did not afford to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quevedo, for that beautiful reading. I am going to give you all just like 1 or 2 minutes to process. And hopefully you can start sharing in the chat, what does it tell you about a testimonial approach to research? And what are some of your first impressions, thoughts, or reactions? And we are, in a journey of like summarizing and conveying powerful things in a way that's digestible. So if you could summarize that in one word or a short sentence, that would be great. So let's start there. Yes, absolutely. Here you are. Okay. Answers are starting to come in. Corinthia says, seeing as in seeing the participants and their experiences. It really made me think about our relationships to participants and our role in empowering them and giving them voice as opposed to using their data for our own purpose. Empowerment, partnership, says Sarah. Thank you for that. Reciprocity, love, being truthful. Um, I, I was struck by the connection between the participants and the researcher. There was understanding and care involved. Thank you for that, Charlotte. And for the rest, if you're still thinking and processing, feel free to keep writing your answers and your thoughts in the chat. One of the things that I was hoping to bring forward is how this compares to what we usually consider as quality research in academia, right? In education, um, how it feels differently, how it sounds differently, and how it conveys, as Sarah was saying, a different type of connection with the people who are collaborating with us in this work. I appreciate the words that are supportive and give us acknowledgement of what is going on without being politically charged. Yes, and also, who is the audience of this excerpt, right? Like, who is the researcher speaking to, and who is she hoping to impact and empower with the work? This is a letter to her participants, right? This is who she is speaking to, and I think that is a great way to root our conversation today. So we're gonna move forward. Thank you so much, Dr. Quevedo, for that. All right. Let's see here. So, in the most literal sense, the Spanish word testimonio translates to testimony, and it refers to a very intentional act of truth telling that centers the experiences of groups that have been historically oppressed, minoritized, and pushed to the margins. Testimonial literature isn't new by any means. It is rooted in the ancient traditions of storytelling that are common within indigenous communities and other communities of color. Um, and it has been used as a way of resistance, a way to break silences from those who are usually considered the other and those who have historically been excluded from traditional forms of literature. There are three characteristics that I would like you to keep in mind. The first one is that testimonials are intentional in whose stories they center. Just like we were reading now, right? Like, who are we speaking to? Who are we speaking about? Who is speaking with us in the work of testimonial? Second characteristic, they are urgent. There is a call for something in testimonial. It is storytelling that is calling for change. It is calling for justice. And third, testimonials emphasize the collective experience of a group, of a community in relation to social political systems, while acknowledging the value of the individual perspective. So we're not necessarily speaking about the I, We are speaking about the we from our voices in Testimonio. So from here, I'm going to invite you to zoom out because we can understand Testimonio as a specific type of research product or a specific method or strategy that we're using in our research. But we can also use it as a broader methodological lens that is guiding and shaping how we structure, how we approach the research process, and how we position ourselves in relation to the work. So, in this sense, testimonial can inform the important decisions that we are making from beginning to end. What frameworks are informing our work, the strategies that we're using to gather and to analyze the data, how we interact with participants, and how we even share our findings, as we saw it at the beginning. So here I have, and let me move this little window. But here, as you can see in the screen, I have attempted to summarize some of the main characteristics of what constitutes testimonial methodology. First, this type of methodology challenges the idea of objective truth. So we are not trying to pursue or to convey the truth about the other. We are concerned with the truth of the other, the truth as lived and experienced by the communities that are collaborating with us in the work. Testimonial methodology examines traditional power dynamics between researcher and subjects. And I was really excited when someone mentioned some of that in the chat earlier, because we are flipping the power as traditionally understood in research work. We are not the experts who are coming to take and extract data from participants. We are in a process of co-construction of knowledge and theory from the lived experience. We are collaborating and building something together. And I think that may sound pretty simple, but it is one of the most difficult things that I think we will do in our careers as researchers, because we have not necessarily been trained that way. We have not been trained to share the expertise and to see those that we have labeled as the others um, as someone who's bringing experience and knowledge that is worthy of being shared in research outlets. So it's going to be a very challenging thing to do. And finally, a testimonial methodology issues an invitation to someone to do something. We're issuing an invitation for the audience to bear witness of something that is urgent to tell, an invitation to question, to reflect, to mobilize, and to resist in many ways. So if we're talking about testimonial as a methodological lens, we need to design a process that honors the essence and purpose of testimonial, because we can't really produce a testimonial-like outcome without a testimonial-like process, right? And here's where I'm also inviting you to zoom out, right? We can think about the text, but we also need to think about what happens as we work towards that final product. And this is what we call a process of testimoniando, which means building and sharing testimonial. And that process will require us
to cover my chairs and AstroTurf, but
uh-oh. Okay, there we go. And so that process of testimoniando will require us to raise an eyebrow at some of the things that we have learned as foundations of what constitutes rigorous and valid scientific research. And part of raising that eyebrow is we need to go beyond this idea of a transaction and move towards this idea of collaboration and co-construction. We are building something together. We need to rethink this approach of taking and extracting, as I was saying earlier. Again, we're building something together, and we're not working in isolation. And that is one of the most difficult things that we're going to have to work on. And a process of testimoniando is always tied to transformation. And when I say transformation, we're not only talking about the audiences that we're hoping to impact and touch with the work, we're talking about transformation of the researcher themselves and also transformation of the communities that are working with us in these projects. So it's transformation all around, and that is at the very core of Testimonio. I think there are 3 questions that can help you begin raising that eyebrow at some of these things. And so you're going to see a lot of self-reflection questions in this presentation, because I really believe in the power of questioning things as we're working towards something. And we're going to share the link to this slide deck if you want to revisit it as an outline as you begin to work on a testimonial process. But the questions are, how do we re-examine and rethink Eurocentric paradigms of designing research historically used as ways of othering communities of color and other marginalized groups? How do we amplify the collective voices of participants, even though we're ultimately the ones narrating their stories? And how do we create space for participants to revisit past and present experiences without re-traumatizing and perpetuating harm? Okay, I want to pause here to see if we have any questions, any comments, perhaps in the chat. Let's see. Okay, I don't think we have any questions yet in the chat. But you are also welcome to unmute yourselves if someone has any questions here before we move on with the presentation, with the session. I'm gonna wait a few minutes. Let's see. All right.
I've had a question. I'm sorry.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm so good. I'm at a research site, so I can't use my video right now.
No worries.
And I'm kind of thinking through this question, so it's not fully formed yet. But a question that I've had as I've been really digging into literature on intersectional research is about publishing in these traditional spaces while trying to ask these really critical questions and conducting research that is authentic, that is, really pushing back against what we're end up doing in the publications. So a question that I have, I think, is about how to do this while still publishing in these traditional spaces that we have to do as tenure track faculty. And how we navigate that while still remaining true to some of the principles that you've talked about already.
For sure. And thank you for that question. I think that is something that we need to acknowledge, right? We are pushing in many ways from within the system. And so we need to be strategic about that. What I will say is that there is an audience for this. And I think part of the intentionality of Testimonio also includes choosing the type of outlet that is going to reach the audiences that we want to reach with this work, right? And there is an audience for this, and it is growing, and it is not as big as other type of outlets and audiences, but it is growing. And I think that we need to be intentional in looking what is going to be the journal that is interested in this work, what is going to be the conference space or the conference platform that is going to be interested in this kind of work, and direct our work toward those outlets and those spaces. I think because there is interest. I think as I was conducting like my dissertation work, I was able to find a lot of scholarship around this. So there is opportunity out there. I just think that we need to be strategic about how we look for it and how we find it and who we're trying to speak to when we do this work. Because there is also this other part about, is our work really reaching the public and the audience that we are trying to reach? And perhaps there is also work that needs to happen about what are other channels and other platforms that we need to reach in order to expand the work and reach more people. But thank you so much for that question.
Thank you so much. I really
Alright.
appreciate that.
Of course. Okay, we're gonna move on, but please feel free to keep typing your questions and your thoughts in the chat as we go. How do we do this? How do we build a process of testimoniando, which is something that, at least for me, and we can talk more about that later, but at least for me, felt so big and so complex and so abstract. I know, I knew that I was like so in tune and aligned with so many of these principles and concepts, but I didn't necessarily know how to do it. So I will say that this process that you're seeing here and that we're going to talk about is informed by mainly the methodological ideas of researchers like Norma Cantu, Lindsay Perez Huber, and the Latina feminist group, also Dolores Delgado Bernal, um, and also from my own insights. And as we build that process of testimoniando, there are 5 areas or elements where I think we have the opportunity to question many of our choices as researchers. Um, and to illustrate that process, I am going to bring examples from my own work, specifically my own dissertation work, but I encourage you to think about your own work as we are going through this. Even if you are not using a testimonial approach in your research, I invite you to ask yourself some of the questions that we are going to go through about your own research design, about your own methodological choices. I think we can do this work in many ways, and I think that many of the things that we're going to talk about will be good to reflect on, even if you are not choosing to do a testimonial approach. All right? Okay, so let's start with the big question first. Why would you adopt a testimonial methodology in the first place? And of course, your research questions, oh, sorry, I'm trying to move my screen here, but um, of course, your research questions and the rationale behind those questions are going to drive a big part of this decision. But a testimonial methodology responds to an issue of systemic nature. So there is an imbalance in the current or in the historical order of things that is impacting specific groups of people. And there is an urgency to tell the stories that are associated to the experience of that imbalance. For example, and I'm providing here one of my research questions for my dissertation, um, I was asking, how do Latinas pursuing associate degrees for transfer in science at a Hispanic serving community college conceptualize the meaning of being a science person and develop their science identities? We know from existing literature that the representation of Latinas is very scarce across STEM pathways, and more specifically, science pathways. When they do enter these STEM spaces, they have to navigate negative stereotypes about their abilities and their very right to be in those spaces. They have to navigate chilly departmental and institutional climates and lack of support. And yet, many Latinas manage to go against the current and they go on to pursue very prolific careers in science. So I wanted to know how they built their science identities while navigating systems that were not built for them. And I decided to look at the community college because Latina students begin post-secondary education at community colleges at higher rates than any other racial group. So what is the role of those spaces that we often categorize as less rigorous, less prestigious? What is their role in developing science identities for Latinas? I wasn't looking only at the individual students. I was looking at those individual students and at that community in relation to the systems that they navigated. So because of my question and because of the rationale that I was bringing behind that question, a testimonial approach seemed like a perfect platform for me to pursue this type of work. We then move on to choosing conceptual frameworks. And when conducting testimonial research, remember that you are actively choosing to tell stories that critically examine and question systemic elements of society. So you need conceptual frameworks that can support that purpose and that can be supported by this type of scholarship, because it is a two-way street, it is a cycle. And the reality is that frameworks that are grounded in the voices and experiences of dominant groups, frameworks that do not account for the intersection of oppressed and minoritized identities, and frameworks that are rooted in deficit views of those at the margins can rarely offer a solid foundation for this type of work. For example, in my own research, I knew that because of the question and the purpose and the story that I wanted to tell, I knew that I needed frameworks that allowed me to look at science identity as something that participants develop not in isolation, but within social political structures that they have to navigate in their daily lives. So I chose to orient my work with frameworks that were grounded in the experiences of communities of color, women of color, frameworks that were also critical of the systems around these communities instead of putting all of their responsibility and blame on the shoulders of these communities. And for me, those frameworks included Latino critical race theory and the framework of intersectionality as theoretical umbrellas for my work. And at a more granular level, the science identity developed by Carlone and Johnson that was grounded in the experiences of women of color pursuing science pathways, and the framework of community cultural wealth developed by Dr. Terioso. Let's see, I want to pause here and see if we have comments here in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Fabiola, I see your question. How do we navigate unlearning our training as we do the work itself? It feels like a constant tugging back and forth, and it can be challenging to do this as you are working with people, training students, etc. Thank you for that question. If it's okay, I think we're going to address some of that as we go on in the presentation. And then if not, I would like to bring this question back at the end so that we can talk about it, because it is a very real and challenging thing that we're all grappling with, if that's okay. All right. Okay. As in any research process, we need to determine who can speak to the particular experiences that we're trying to address. And in Testimonio, there are going to be many nuances to the stories we're trying to piece together. So we need to ask whose perspectives can help deepen the testimonio, who can possibly add dimensions to the story, who are we not including, and why are we not including them? And remember that if we're focusing on groups that have been pushed to the margins in educational spaces, we need to get creative and very intentional about how we reach them. What are the channels that we are using to spread the word about the research opportunity? Are there organizations or networks that can support your efforts in this process of inviting people to your research? And I want to spend some time here in this idea of recruitment as we see it in research, because if we're thinking of Testimonio as a decolonial approach, we do have the opportunity to reframe this idea of recruitment as an invitation to build something together. And that sense of collaboration will hopefully permeate the language and the tone of your invitation materials, but also the way that you interact with potential participants and the organizations that may be supporting you. I think, Fabiola, to your question, this is one part of the process where I think we have an opportunity to question the way that we have traditionally framed recruitment materials and how we're putting the information out there. And you are right when you say, well, we have to constantly go back and forth. And this is part of that collaboration. how are we building these materials? Who is giving feedback? Are we reaching out to other people to bring a critical eye into the way that we are framing things and the language and the tone that we are using? I know that for me, in in my dissertation work, my initial thought immediately, because of my training, was, well, I am going to print a bunch of flyers. I am going to post them around campus, and that is going to bring people to the research, right? And I was tremendously wrong. And in conversations with some peers, with my advisor, with members of my committee, with fellow researchers, Dr. Quevedo included as well, it's like, well, where are these participants? Where are they? And are they even going to understand what you are inviting them to? And how can you reach more people? And who are the networks who already have access and connections to those people? And so what I ended up doing was partnering with coordinators of support programs that serve Latinx students at the community college, faculty members that were teaching in the science-related associate degrees for transfer programs that I was targeting in my research, and also student leaders who had access to STEM-focused student groups. And just to be totally honest, it is going to take time and it's going to take more effort than we expect because of the type of work that we are trying to do. Um, there is this trust that has been built over years because of the many violent approaches that have been taken to traditional ways of doing research. So you are trying to build trust from the very beginning in your work, and that is going to take time to talk to people about the research, to give them the opportunity to know more about this. And as you build that trust, that is going to be the foundation of your process of testimonio. I wanted to show you an example of how I framed my invitation materials for my testimonial process. To the left here is the flyer that I used to communicate like the overall elements of the work. And to the right, you can see some of the language that was introducing the initial participant screening questionnaire. And I will give you maybe like 2 or 3 minutes to read some of this. And I would like to hear from you also, what would you improve here? Now that you have heard about the principles of testimonio and the type of tenets that guide this testimonio approach to research, what would you frame differently here? How do you think this could be improved to better convey that sense of collaboration and honoring someone else's cooperation in the work? And just so you know that you're asking, but so as I said at the beginning, I'm an instructional designer. And we do a lot of like, professional development and working groups. Um, so the silence for me is like, well, people are thinking. So if at some point you feel like, oh, this silence is awkward, I'm not feeling it that way. And I apologize if it's feeling that way. I'm just like giving space for people to process. Sarah saying, I had a mentor who suggested including a little bit about the intersectional methodological approach in the invitation materials. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that. Sarah, would you mind expanding on that? So when you're saying including info about the intersections, are you talking about like the different intersecting identities that you're bringing into the work and communicating that to potential participants?
That was part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that I've struggled to conceptualize when I'm thinking about invitation materials. Um,
Mm-hmm.
this particular conversation was more trying to be responsible or being clear about what happens to your stories once you share them.
Yep.
In the invitation materials, which I found really difficult to do in a way that's clear and concise. So I don't have suggestions to answer your question, but it's more, I guess, more of a question to your question,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
about how
sure.
you are clear about, if you come and if you choose to join me in this, what is actually going to happen to your words. And I think that's a really key piece to how we're inviting folks. But I don't have any answers, so I was wondering what your thoughts.
For sure. And thank you for that. I think it's a brilliant idea. I know that for me, my process, I incorporated some of that at the consent stage, which came after this, right? And we'll talk more about consent as a fluid process in Testimonio. But I know that a lot of those explanations around what happens to your research and what's going to happen to your story and how much control you have over it happened at that consent stage. But I could definitely see how, for example, if we could have like a QR code or like a link to like a 2 slide overview of this is what's going to happen with your data and with your story and your testimonial. And if you feel comfortable also like recording a short video, I could see how that would be pretty neat too, right? Like as an initial way of speaking to the person in a very personal way and conveying the overall idea and logistics of the study. That might be a really cool way to do it at the beginning. Thank you, everyone. We are going to move on. This is perhaps my favorite part of the process to discuss here, the process of gathering and analyzing data in Testimonio. And it is my favorite part because it is also the most challenging. I have to say, the stories that you are trying to recover, to retell, are complex. They are layered. They are often hard for participants to revisit and tell. And so there are 3 elements that I want to emphasize here. And the first one is intentionality. What is the purpose of each stage of data collection and analysis in your process? Who does it serve? Is it serving only you as the researcher? How do participants and the testimonio itself benefit from each part of the process? I think this also goes back to Fabiola's question, right? This process of constantly having to rethink each choice that you are making, because in many ways we are unlearning a process that can seem at times very mechanic. We're not only here to serve the research and our purposes as researchers, we are here to serve the communities and the participants who are working with us in this journey. A second element is analytic spirals. Building Testimonio is going to require that ability and time to go back and forth, constantly revisiting different levels of data to generate richer analytic outcomes and a richer story. And I want to acknowledge here that we are doing this work within very inflexible systems that rarely are going to afford us the time and the resources to do that. But when we choose to embark on testimonial research and use this approach to our work, we have a responsibility towards the participants and the stories that we are going to be putting forward and sharing. And so I think we owe it to them and to the work to find a balance in the middle of it all, right? Like, how can we do this work in a very intentional way? And how can we constantly come back and come back in an analytic spiral so that we are really telling the story as it's meant to be told? And finally, the ethical approach of it all. In this work, we're honoring someone's stories and experiences. How does the process that you are putting together reflect that sense of respect for your participants? I'm going to give you the example of what I did for my dissertation work. But again, as I said at the beginning, this is only an example, right? Like you can choose, someone else would choose to structure it differently. And that would be also okay. It depends on what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, and who you're working with. But in my process of testimoniando, I had 3 different stages of data collection and analysis, and I bring them together, those two, because for me, the process of gathering and analyzing data happens simultaneously. And that is at the core of qualitative research, right? Like this idea of collecting the data and then waiting until the end to really go through it is not going to work for this type of research. You need to be able to come back and bring it back to participants and then go back again. But in the first phase, I had participants engage with individual written reflections, and there were 2 purposes for this. First of all, it's really, really hard and not realistic to think that someone that has never met you before is going to come and open up to you in a very authentic way about something that is so personal. We were talking about identity development. We were talking about things that participants, many of them, had not thought about before in their science journeys. So I wanted to offer the individual written reflection as a way for them to start building that trust and open up with me, but also as a way to start setting the tone of the story. The type of questions that I included here were geared towards how they saw themselves as human beings, as science people within the systems where they were pursuing their science degrees. And so that was really helpful to set the tone and see where they wanted to go with the story. Of course, keeping in mind my research questions and the way that I was framing the work. Then we had 2 rounds of individual interviews. In my research, I had 2 areas of focus. I had science identity and I had mentorship in relation to science identity. Again, this is deep work. This is going to take time. A testimonio like interview is going to be deep and it's going to be long. So to ask participants to sit with me for 2 hours didn't make any sense. So I decided to split the interview rounds into phases. So we met at 2 different times to explore each of the aspects. This also served the purpose of giving me as a researcher more time to go back and revisit, because remember, I was trying to do an analytic spiral. So as I reached phase 2, I was going back to phase 1 and trying to do some preliminary analysis and coding here so that I could also bring those parts and my interpretation of those parts of the story to them to co-construct with me. And then the last phase was a focus group. And, this one was very interesting to me and very enlightening, because when I first thought about focus groups, I was only thinking about member checking. So I was thinking, well, this is going to be a space for me to bring my preliminary analysis and the themes that I think are coming out of the stories and our work together for participants to tell me if this is an authentic way to represent their stories. And I remember one member of my committee specifically, she kept pushing back and she kept telling me, well, who is this serving? This is only serving you. If you're only doing a focus group, you are making these women give you their time so that you can benefit for the final product that you are going to write. And in that process, it was frustrating, it was challenging, but what ended up becoming, I was so grateful for it, because the focus groups became another opportunity to co-construct knowledge together. So what we did, in addition to the member checking, was that participants and I studied the conceptual frameworks that I was bringing to the work, and we critiqued them together. So they had time to study this very theoretical, abstract frameworks that I was using to frame their stories, and they started analyzing those. They started pointing out where were the gaps, How did those frameworks represent and fell short in relation to their stories of building a science identity? And we also engaged in a process of critiquing the system together. So how could community colleges better support Latinas who are in the process of building science pathways and developing a science identity? So, in that way, I think it's a really good example of how we need to constantly be unlearning these processes, and who are we serving with the processes of research that we are bringing forth. I want to talk here about this idea of authenticity and scientific rigor, because I know it was one of the questions that came up for you all. And I'm going to start by reading you how I introduced this in my own research. While driving to grab lunch, a friend of mine and fellow researcher reminded me that we are vessels for participants' stories. Beyond all my efforts to be as loyal as possible to these women's lived experiences, I ultimately am the vessel that delivers their stories to you. Thus, is it not just their voices, but our collective voice that shows up in this work? That said, I strove to make their voices louder and stronger, and implemented multiple strategies to convey an authentic representation of their testimonials. We need to remember that in Testimonio, we are not pursuing an idea of objective truth. We are, sorry, I have to move this here. What we're talking about when talking about authenticity and rigor is checking ourselves as researchers and our own positionality within the work. It is a collective voice that is going to emerge from the testimonial work, but participants' voices must be louder than our voices as researchers, and we have to be very intentional in how we keep ourselves in check, and how we make sure that that collective voice is really representing the stories that they mean to tell in the way that they are meaning to tell it. Just to give you a few examples, I engaged in member checking at different stages of the research, bringing my interpretations and my themes and the things that I was coming up to participants and letting them know, this is how I'm seeing it. What would you change? How would you rewrite this? The co-construction of knowledge, this is something that needs to be a thread in your research. If you're saying that you're building something together, you really need to open spaces for people to see what you're doing. I know it's really tempting to work in isolation in our computer with our teams of fellow researchers, but we need to break those patterns a little bit and get out of that bubble. We need to show the work to the communities that are collaborating with us, because that is going to be part of that co-construction. Triangulating analysts, you need to bring other people to the work. You need to bring people who are going to ask the difficult questions, who are going to offer different perspectives, and that are going to challenge your thinking. And this process of reflective journaling, right? I know that for me it was really helpful to keep a journal of how I was reacting to some of the things that I was hearing. I had many personal connections with the community and the phenomenon and the experience that I was looking at. And so I was reacting as they were telling me the stories, as I was reading the transcripts, as I was thinking about this work, and recording all of that was helping me say, okay, this is what I'm bringing, and this is how I'm bringing it, and this is how I need to position it to tell the stories that they are meaning to tell. Um, we're getting close to wrap up. So here I want to bring you back to where we started for this stage of retelling the testimonials. And it's the why of the testimonial in the first place. If testimonials are born from an urgency to challenge the order of things, this really needs to translate to the tone and to the way that we deliver the final product of testimonial. Because remember that we're issuing an invitation to the audience to connect with something that may be very far from their own experience of the world. And this is where testimonial is political, right? Because it's meant to disrupt silences and to disrupt things that would better stay ignored. And because it is disruptive, it also has the power to transform not only the reader, as I said before, but the researcher and participants. I know that for me, this work has stayed with me for the past 2 years, and every time that I revisit it, it tells me something different. It's a living document in many ways, what you are co-constructing with participants. Um, I want to call attention to this element here, resistance from the margins and from the center, because you are centering participants in this work, but also you have infiltrated the center in many ways. We are operating within the systems of higher education and academia and research that were not necessarily meant or built for many of us. And we have a platform to tell these stories. And I think that we need to be very mindful and intentional about how we use that platform as we bring this work forward and as we center the voices of the communities that we are trying to center. We are at the end. If I can have one of my co-facilitators here read this final excerpt. This is coming from my testimonial work in my dissertation work, and I think it's going to wrap up the tone and this invitation that I'm saying that we need to issue in Testimonio. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Most participants said navigating negative stereotypes was a salient aspect of their Latina identities. In their pursuit of science, they often felt underestimated, being the target of implicit and sometimes explicit messages that suggested science was not for them. Despite participants' intentions to brush off and not pay attention to these stereotypes and narratives around them, many of them still said they experienced self-doubt and fear of eventually confirming negative stereotypes. Silvana described an unspoken, silent thing that floated around her, a voice in the back of her head that contributed to the internal pressure that she put on herself to avoid failure and always excel. Stereotypes about Latinas in science, is a general thing, like an unspoken thing, at least in my experience. The way people sort of look at you different but don't say anything. I can feel that, like they say it with their eyes. The pressure definitely sways a lot of my decisions and makes me question my abilities to do things sometimes. Even though I still have that mindset that I can do whatever I put my mind to, but at the same time, there's always that voice in the back of my head. Even though it is unspoken, still is a voice in the back of my head. It is an internal pressure that I do not want to fail, or else people are going to think I am incapable.
Thank you so much, Corinthia, for reading. I'm going to stop my share now, and we can hopefully have a chat. If you have questions, comments, I think we can open the conversation up. And I'm trying to read the chat, but it's, yeah. And I guess perhaps a question that I have for you, for everyone as you think through this, is how do you see this maybe integrating parts of the work that you are currently doing? What are some questions or what are you still like questioning about it? How do you think it could be integrated, even if you are not doing testimonial work? Fabiola says, working on my dissertation work using pláticas and oh my God, hard, challenging, and helping me grow. Thank you for that. I think, something that I didn't quite say, but it's important to say as well, is that this work takes twice the time than we anticipate. And I know that when we reach, at least like for those of you being in graduate programs and also in tenure track positions, we have this anxiety living within us, right? Like you have timelines, you have deadlines. How do you make it work? And I just want to acknowledge that. And this was a conversation that I repeatedly had with my advisor and my committee. How much is too much? How do we stay true? Because I was swimming in data. I had so much, and I felt this responsibility around conveying the stories that I had, and then how do you keep that balance as well? And I think that that's something that's going to challenge you constantly. Um, I think it's important to acknowledge. Rachel asks, is it possible to use this methodology from a position of privilege? I would be a privileged outsider asking people to trust me, and I never want to assume anything. That's a beautiful question to ask. My short answer is yes. I think we need more and more people doing this work. And I think it's definitely a mindset and an approach that we can all adopt, right? Even if you're in a position of privilege, I think it requires a level of unlearning, as someone was saying before, and a level of self questioning and self critiquing and going back and forth, that is going to help to move the work forward. I also think, on the other side, we cannot put the weight of this only on communities of color and researchers of color and those who have been historically oppressed and who have been also at the margins. So I think the more of us who can do this work, the better. I think it's possible, and not only that, I think it's needed. I'm curious about the quality of participants' reflections, particularly because this was conducted prior to initial interview. I could imagine some students may not complete this as we would like. What things were helpful to relay expectations for this component, or helpful in making students feel comfortable, willing to share their reflections? I think this relates also to the idea of consent as a fluid and processing testimonio, right? We need to remember that we're issuing an invitation to collaborate. We're never forcing anyone, and we can convey expectations clearly, but how much people disclose, that is up to them. They own the knowledge, right? And we need to remember that as we go through the process. And that is why in testimonio also you need to design a process that's going to allow you and participants to go back to these topics that you are hoping to reflect on, right? Because you're right, like at the beginning in the writing reflections, we were not going as deep, right? And that wasn't the purpose. And that's why we had several other opportunities to come together and continue to explore those topics. So I think that's important, and that's why it's so long too. I don't think that we can build a testimonial with one interview, right? Or things that are not going to give you and participants that opportunity to stretch and really dig deep into these things, because these are things that are hard to revisit. And many times they're hidden, even for participants, right? There are things that they haven't thought about. I know that that was the case for many of participants in this study, right? They had not thought about science identity in the way that I was asking them to think about. And I needed to be mindful of that as well. Well, thank you so much for the space, to the organizers. If you want to continue this chat, I'm always open to it and excited to talk about it. I hope that if you're taking something out of this session and our time together, it's that there is space for this work. And I want to acknowledge that we are currently in a climate that is going to make it more difficult, and that is going to make it feel like we cannot do this. I think that it's important to think about self-care as well. You cannot design processes that are healing and restorative if you are not feeling healthy, and if you're not being compassionate to what you need, right? So activism and resistance and this type of scholarship comes in all types of ways. And I would encourage you to check in with yourselves, perhaps today what you have the energy to do is to grab a coffee with a colleague and engage in conversations about this. Perhaps it's not a whole testimonial like methodology, but it is a small thing. And then I think we need to be very mindful of that. What do you have the energy to do? And do that. And then do the next thing. And I think in that way we can keep moving forward.
Well, thank you, Dr. Diaz Benitez, so much for speaking with us today. I've learned so many things, and it sounds like everyone did from the chat as well. And we just really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insight with the rest of us. And for everyone who joined, thank you all so much. I also want to say thank you to the Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee, as well as Dr. Chen, Dr. Ellis, and Dr. Agger, who are working on the subcommittee with me. And we'll upload the recording to the Division 15 YouTube channel. And then we'll also email out the slides to everyone who registered. So if you're here, I'm guessing you registered, and so you should get the slides as well. So, and it looks like we may have one last question as well, or if more come up, but.
Hello, could
Hello.
you hear me? Oh, sorry.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. My name is Supavit. I am from Thailand, so it's about 2 a.m. in the morning right now.
Oh, wow.
I would like to reflect on the talk. Well, my English is not quite good because it's not my first language, but I want to reflect as well. It is indeed an insightful talk, and I found many points from the talk very well. Since we have a difference in historical background because we were not like colonized in the past, we still I still found many points of the talk relevant, and I think I can apply to see in like from in my area of interest in my society. So I would like to thank for having this space, and I would like to ask whether we are going to have like the similar talk like this, I mean like next time or the next event, so I can like looking forward to it. So thank you very much. Actually, I have question regarding like whether the video would be post afterward, but I already got the answer. So not that I have many questions, but thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad it was informative and helpful.
Thank you so much for asking that question, because that does remind me that we will have 2 more talks in this series as well. So I'm very grateful that you brought up that question. We'll have 2 more, one talking about taking critical approaches in quantitative methods, and then another talk that is taking anti-racist and anti-colonial approaches in qualitative research. And that will happen, we're planning them out, but it looks like it'll be in May. And you'll receive another email through the same avenue that you likely found out about this one, but we can also perhaps send it to the registrants list, so to make sure that you get it. And then I believe we'll likely aim for the second and last talk of this research series to be in June. However, the Race and Diversity Committee does a lot of really wonderful work, and so there are so many different things going on. We have a syllabus challenge with taking anti-colonial approaches in educational psychology and how we can really revamp our classes to take anti-colonial and anti-racist approaches. So keep an eye out for all of the great work that Division 15 is doing in general, but also the Race and Diversity Committee. And we will have 2 more sessions. And so we'll make sure you all get that information. But just once again, thank you, Dr. Diaz Benitez, and thank you all for being here and learning and listening with us all today. So take care, everyone.